Live. Hello. This is again the continuation of the Christmas lectures here at Staffordshire University. That was very good talk, Jamie. But we're gonna
I
transfer
agree,
over
it was
to
fantastic.
Jennifer, who's talking about the tension between NPC autonomy and player agency. As someone who you play video games, I play video games. What are your thoughts on player agency?
Oh, me.
Mm, mm,
I like a bit of player agency. It's a very interesting area.
mm,
I will be making notes.
yeah, me too as well. Because the word tension's there, and that's all me. I oftentimes when I DM, I think sometimes I can forget that player agency is a thing that um exists. Um, and I find that sometimes I can be caught lacking with it. So I'm really interested to see
Well,
to
hopefully
hear
Jennifer can
what
educate.
Jennifer has to say. Yeah. So we'll bring Jennifer forward, and she can get started.
Hi everyone, how are we all doing? Okay, so today we're going to be having a little bit of a look at the agency that NPCs have in video games in regards to how they're perceived as romance options. And we're going to take a little bit of a look about how the player themselves can really interact with those options and some of the choices that they can get to make versus the choices that may have been made for them. So the title of this is currently the agencies of NPCs as romance options, or as I like to call it, in theme with us, being a Christmas lecture, love, possibly. Haha, see, it was all linked, it was all there. So today we're going to be taking a look at some of these explorations of romance options as they exist in video games. We're going to take a bit of an analysis at the agency that the characters have versus the agency that the player gets to have. We're going to take a look at some of the limits of that, about how that can interact with representation, and how that can have a big impact on player experience. So, just as a bit of a mature content warning, we're not going to be showing anything explicit in this lecture. It's supposed to be educational, it's in the daytime, it's Christmas themed, it should be family friendly. But because we're talking about romance options here, one of the things that does come up quite a lot in games with romance options is sex scenes. They happen quite a lot and they're going to be mentioned, they won't be shown, but if you're not comfortable with that, if you're looking at this thinking, "Oh, that's not something I might want to hear about," then, by all means, feel free to turn the lecture off, no judgment. Ultimately, you are who you are and you are comfortable with what you're comfortable with. Um, so yeah, so about me. I am primarily an artist, that's what I teach here at the university, and I'm also an academic. I've been published a few times on the field of AR. I haven't been published on this field in terms of, romance and such and representation. The reason I'm giving this talk is more because it's really interesting to me, especially because of discussions that have happened online in fairly recent weeks since Baldur's Gate 3 came out. It really did reignite some old discussions that I found really fascinating, particularly because I saw quite a lot of discussions in LGBT circles on X and on Tumblr and such. And they were some really good conversations, but they're conversations that some people may not have heard much about, specifically because we're at a point in sort of cultural development now where more and more of LGBT culture is sort of appearing in the mainstream. But when it comes to discussions by the community, the media only really ever tends to report on stuff that's like a really big positive or a really big negative. You don't really hear much about the in between. And because these conversations were incredibly civil, they didn't really bleed over quite as much. But I really think it's a good opportunity to get people talking about this and sort of see some perspectives on how games have handled stuff. So that's kind of the reason why I want to give this talk. And it's also the reason why I'm incredibly nervous. This is the first time in years I've given a lecture where I've actually got butterflies in my stomach because, again, this is just new territory for me. The other thing I want to talk about is that, I'm a forever DM. And if you don't know what that means, in tabletop role-playing games, I forever take the role of the dungeon master. I am the player that controls the storyline, create the characters, I set the events, and the players experience the game world that I make. And that gives me some insights into how games set things up about how characters can be portrayed, because that's the type of thing I think about all the time as well. So, delving in, let's talk a bit about romance options. Now, when it comes to romance in a story, whether that's a book or a film or a TV show or a comic book, romance is often used as a bit of a plot hook. It's like a motivation for a character that they're going to do things because they're interested in someone else and they want to sort of pursue that into a relationship. It can be used as a tool for their development, or it could be perceived as an end goal. So, the old sort of fairy tale setup of the knight that goes off on the journey and fights the monster to save the princess so that they can get married and fall in love. And that's like the end goal. It's not the crux of the story, it's just the thing that happens at the end. Now, whenever we're watching a romance storyline, there's not really any agency that the viewer has in regards to it, right? I mean, the story is pre-written. So even if you have a strong opinion regarding what you think a romance should do, you don't really get any say in that. And also, typically speaking, they're very one-sided. Like, you'll get two characters that are sort of attracted to each other, and over the course of the plot, they'll sort of, grow closer. But in the late the late noughties to sort of the early tens, we saw this really big cultural shift where the concept of the love triangle popped up more and more, where the character didn't just have one love interest, they had multiple. And they had to make a choice. They had to decide, who am I going to end up with at the end of this? Which of these characters am I going to be in a romantic relationship with? And we got a few examples of that. So the notable one being Twilight, where we had Bella that had to choose between Edward or Jacob. We had True Blood, where Suki had to choose between Bill or Eric. And we also had examples like the Vampire Diaries, where Elena had to choose between Stefan or Damon. And I just need to ask, what exactly was happening back from sort of 2008 onwards that made everyone really interested in vampires all of a sudden? Was there something in the drinking water or something? I don't know. I'll ask Jamie afterwards. He's the vampire expert. But I digress, right? This sort of popped up and it became more and more popular, but very different. Suddenly, as the player, you had the option, you had some agency to actually influence these stories and decide how the romances were going to play out, which was really quite interesting because that suddenly gave people freedom to explore romance in a way that they just didn't get to before, at least not in terms of media. So that's something that I really am quite interested in. And, I'm a hopeless romantic. I love this stuff. I love romance stories. And when you get the choice of, experimenting with that in video games, that's really exciting to me. So when we talk about romance in video games, we first need to break this down into a few categories. And these are categories that, for the most part, don't really exist. Yeah, these are sort of categories that I've conjured out of thin air for the sake of this talk. But we can put each game, or at least a game with a romance plot, into one of three sections. So let's take a look at them. So, option A, we've got the predefined love category. This is one where the characters in the story are much the same as they would be in a film or a TV show. The character is scripted to end up with another specific character, and as we play through the game, that's inevitably going to happen one way or another. We don't have any choice over that. So Uncharted 4, Nate and Elena are always going to end up together, regardless of what you think about the other characters, because while you're playing as Drake, you aren't Drake. He's his own character, he's his own person, and he makes his own choices. Now, these games are completely great, and I love them. Sometimes it is nice to just, put things on the back seat and just watch a story play out in front of you. But as the player, you don't get any agency over that. So there are definitely pros and cons there. In category B, we have the option of player choice. These are the games where, again, you're not supposed to be playing as yourself. You're playing as a character that already exists. So the example I've got here is The Witcher 3, where we play as Geralt. And in that storyline, you have to make a bit of a choice between if Geralt is going to end up with Triss or if he's going to end up with Yennefer. And, in the context of gameplay, you can't customize Geralt's character except for a few cosmetics. You can't change his personality. You can't change anything about him. Fundamentally, he is still the same person that he is in the books, but you do get to make a couple of little decisions for him over the course of the plot, and that can influence things like the romance options and such. And again, these games are great, and I definitely enjoy playing them, but they're not really the topic of what we're going to be talking about today. The kind that I'm the most interested in, and the kind that this really pertains to the most, is category C, which I refer to as original character driven. In the context of this, you're supposed to be playing as your own representation of you in the game world. Most of the time, this includes actually customizing or creating your own character, but not always. Sometimes you do get given a hard to find appearance or very limited options, but the emphasis of gameplay is that your character is supposed to be you, or at least a representation of you in the game world. And to that extent, you make your own choices. You get the option of pursuing love interests. You get the option of making really big plot decisions and such. And that's really the type of thing I want to focus on today. And, these types of games are really quite fun for a lot of reasons because of the amount of agency and control they give you. And because you can potentially have lots of characters that, can mean different things to different people who are playing them. For example, if I take a look here at Story of Seasons, there's, a lot of characters presented here. And I know my sister, if she's watching this stream right now, she's looking at this guy down here and she's already swooning because he's blonde and he's wearing glasses, and that is her type to a T. Sorry, Lauren, I had to call you out like that. So, what I'm interested in first is I want to hear your opinions on this. I want to find out the types of games that you play that fit that category. So if you've not used WooClap before, you can either scan the QR code here, or you can go to the website and enter this code to vote in the poll. But I want you to tell me what games have you played that fit that category? The only requirements being is that the players should be your own direct representation in game. There should be multiple romance options that you can choose to pursue, and that romance should be able to end with actual romance rather than just, the implied possibility of it maybe happening in the future. So I'm going to draw this up on my other screen, and I have got this set to moderator mode, so I'm going to be, filtering responses. I say that entirely because we're streaming this on the internet, and I've been around long enough to see how that goes when you give people unrestricted access to polls like this. So I'm only going to linger on this for about a minute or so. In the off chance that you're watching if you're watching the video of this sort of at a later on point in time, please let me know in the comments what type of games that you've played, because if there's any on this list that I haven't played, I want to. I'm excited by the concept that there's games with romance options that I've not played. Yeah, I'm seeing some of these filter in now. These are great. Seeing a lot of games I recognize. I'm seeing one on this list that I've never heard of, which is great. Whoever typed in episode, I don't know what episode means. I think you may need to put the rest of the game name in there. So I'll give this about another 15 seconds, and then we'll take a look. To the person who put Dream Daddy, yep. Respect that you wanted to put that on this list. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, so this is the word cloud that we just generated from here. If Firefox would allow me to move that across, that would be phenomenal. So there we go. This is the little word cloud of games that people have played that fit this category. Now, I actually haven't heard of a bunch of these, which is really interesting, like Starstruck Vagabond. Don't know what that is. Haven't heard of the Arcana, but hey, I'm excited to look into some of these and see what some of those options are. The one that I can see appeared in Elite 3, which I'm really not too surprised by. I mean, it is the most recent example. But yeah, I think this goes to show as well that there's a bunch of people who are interested in this type of gameplay, which is fantastic. So, moving on. We're going to have a little bit of a conversation about the mechanics of this. Now, I'm not going to linger on this for too long because I feel like Jamie already covered most of this in his class before. But typically speaking, you'll get the romance options in the game, and as you play through the game and you meet the character that you want to romance, you'll make some dialogue choices in response to them that seem flirty or sort of appropriate towards building towards romance. And sometimes you'll make gameplay decisions that, if you make certain choices that adhere to the interests and beliefs of that character, they'll like you more. If you go against them, then they might like you less. And that's sort of, it's a pretty cut and dry mechanic, but it works quite well. It's worked well for a while. It's a way of letting the player steadily interact with a romance option and build towards that towards the end of the game. And ultimately, that typically in a lot of situations, you'll do this all game long, and then right before the end, you'll get your romance scene with that character, and that will normally be the culmination of that storyline. And that's great. But there's a bit of a problem with that, because which character do you pick if you're given lots of options? And you might have some ideas about the characters that you like. You'll take a look through the roster and you'll figure out the characters that maybe you're attracted to, or maybe they're the ones that have personalities that kind of vibe most with yours. And that's something that you might want to pursue. But then as you progress, you might discover that just because they're romance options, they might not be romance options available to you. And that creates a very interesting barrier for the player, because ultimately, even though the player might want to pursue a very specific romance option, that romance option might be coded to have a very specific sexuality or a very specific set of interests. That means that the player doesn't get to pursue that character. And that instantly is something really interesting for video games as a whole, and definitely something that I look at, as a forever DM, is that the game is ultimately not real, right? It's a fantasy. It's something that's been created to let players jump in and hold a controller and have some fun with. But suddenly it's putting limitations in the way. It's saying, no, you can't do this thing. And that can be interesting from a narrative perspective, but it can be frustrating from a player perspective. For example, if you were playing Pathfinder Kingmaker and you were playing a male character and you decided, hey, I really like Tristan and I want to romance him, he's heterosexual, so you just don't have that option. And it doesn't just end there, because some other games impose other limitations as to the types of characters that you can romance. The one that I really want to draw attention to is from Dragon Age Inquisition, where the species that you pick during character creation can potentially lock out some of the romance options for you. It's entirely possible that you could prevent yourself from pursuing the character that you want to pursue based entirely off that decision, and you have no idea that you have done this until the game begins. So let me take, for example, let's say that you wanted to play a female character in Dragon Age Inquisition, and if you're like me, you picked Kunari straight away, and you want to romance one of the male characters. Well, let's go through the list. So the male love interests we get in the game are Blackwall, Iron Bull, Dorian, Cullen, and Solus. Well, if we take a look through that list, Blackwall, yep, he is always available. That character, you'll always be able to romance him, that's fine. Same with Iron Bull. Absolutely no restrictions there. Bisexual character, you can romance him if you want to. If you're interested in Dorian, well, that one's off the charts because he's a gay character. He's not going to be interested in you playing a female character. But then we take a look at Cullen and Solus, and they will reject you based on the fact that you are playing a character that doesn't fit their species preference, which is it's strange. Okay, I've seen conversations about this. Some people think it makes for more interesting character development, but other people have just rejected it, saying that it's frustrating to have your options limited from the get-go like that, especially if you really do enjoy playing certain types of character. Because ultimately you have to make a choice then. Am I gonna, on my next run of the game, am I gonna play something different than what I might want to play? Or am I gonna have to choose a different love interest if I want to pursue that angle? And then the other thing that lingers over you is, how do you know what those characters' interests are? Because you might not always be able to tell if a character is going to be a love interest until it's way too late. If you were to play Dragon Age Inquisition and you were to start romancing one of the characters, which the game will let you do, you get the option of flirting with everyone for pretty much most of the game. But if the character doesn't very specifically state that they're not into you, there's a good chance you could get through a lot of the game sort of thinking that eventually you were going to get the chance with this character, only to discover far too late that no, you won't, and it's now too late to pursue an alternative character. So that can be quite frustrating, and it's the reason why big wikis like this one exist, where players will more often than not have to metagame and plan out in advance what they're going to do in order to satisfy the criteria for the characters that they want to romance. And that's, again, it's just something interesting that games have done. It can be really interesting or well written, or it can be really frustrating. But those two concepts are always at odds with each other. You know, how much agency are we going to give the NPCs, and how much of the player experience do we want to enrich versus, potentially keep to reality? That's something that we're not going to find a definitive conclusion to today. All we're really seeking to do at this point is just open the discussion and get people talking about it. And I do want to hear people's opinions on this. That is really important to me. So next, we're going to take a little bit of a look at how sexuality has been handled in video games. Now, I know Jamie just went through some of the mechanics of this and looked at a few characters. I'm looking at some slightly different examples to really see how this was handled. So the first game I ever played that had romance options in it that you could pursue was Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic back on my old classic Xbox. Similar system, you talk to the characters often, you pick the responses that kind of imply that you're flirting with them, and then at the end of the game you get a little romance scene. And this was actually the first game where BioWare included a same-sex romance option as well, which is also really interesting to talk about. And there were 3 of these that you could pursue. You have Bastila, who's a Jedi. She's romanceable by male characters. You've got Karth, a soldier, and he's romanceable by female characters. Also the same voice actor as Caden from Mass Effect, so if you killed him, I'm judging you. And also Jahani, who's a Jedi, and she's only romanceable by female characters, which, again, this is actually pretty big for the era that, BioWare have thought to include this. Except it didn't exactly go as well as it could have. See, the dialogue that they chose to use, like the way that the characters were written, didn't make it abundantly clear that Jahani was actually a love interest. You had to pay very, very, very careful attention to dialogue you have with her when you first meet her near the beginning of the game to figure out that, that she's a sapphic character, that she's interested in women. And if you missed that, and again, it's not very well established because 2004, you might well have missed out on that completely. And I think that really comes across the most during the actual romance and like the scenes you get with the characters. So here's Karth. You romance Karth at the end of the game, little love confession. He tells you he loves you. Really cute, very adorable. Love this man. If you romance Bastila, she tells you too. She loves you with all of her heart. Isn't she sweet for someone who betrayed you 10 minutes beforehand? Very, very well written, very sort of clearly defined right there that is her intention. If you romance Jahani, if you actually get through all of these strangely mixed signals and oddly written dialogue to get to this point, Jahani cares for you. BioWare, we were so close. We were almost there. They just wouldn't quite commit to using the word love for some reason. And the thing that really tickles me about this is that a lot of players actually did manage to romance Jahani and didn't realize that this was her love mission at the end of the game. People missed that completely, which for 2 women who've been flirting with each other the entire game, when one finally makes the love confession to the other and it goes over their heads completely, that is so hilariously on brand that I love it. I'm sorry, wait, no, I care for it. So moving on a few years, BioWare released another game, this one, Dragon Age Origins. Now, this time around, there's 4 romance options as opposed to 3, and this time there are same-sex relations available for both male and female characters. This isn't the first time that BioWare have done this. In Jade Empire, there were same-sex romance options available for both male and female characters as well, but the game's a little bit older, and it was a lot harder to find people discussing it, just because it was right before that period where people were actively talking about games online on a more frequent basis. So there's less information out there. But for Dragon Age Origins, as I was doing my research for this lecture, one thing that I found was I found this essay written by someone whose name I'm probably going to butcher, and I do profusely apologize. I think it's Annika Wern. But they wrote this very comprehensive breakdown of how people reacted to the romance options in Dragon Age Origins, and effectively did this big scowl through the internet and were looking for how many people were talking about each character, which found that of all of the four, Alistair was the most discussed romance option. He was the one that people were talking about. He was the one that people were most interested in. And he was very much a heterosexual romance option. You could only romance Alistair if you were playing as a female character, which actually got quite a lot of lamentations from the gay community who were interested in pursuing him as an option, but just couldn't. Followed by him was Morrigan, who's a mage, and she was a very evil character. If she released today, I imagine the most tweeted response to her would be, "I can fix her." Spoiler alert, you can't. Followed by Zevran, and then followed by Leliana. So this was a more of an interesting option because you have four characters, all of them being romance options, except this time you've got two characters who are openly bisexual and will very comfortably talk to you about their experiences with that. Zevran in particular, he is very, very open about his sexuality. That is a point that recurs throughout the game. He really is very much in need of going to horny jail, but alas. So next up, another game I want to talk about is The Sims. The Sims is really quite notable for its era, and someone did pick up on this in the chat from the previous lecture. The Sims allows you to romance any Sims that you want to. You can make any pairings that you want, and the mechanics for that are quite simple because each Sim has opinions of other Sims, and as they grow, they start to become more friendly, and that can eventually lead into either platonic friendships or it can lead into romance if it's pursued. Now, there was a complex history of The Sims where, originally the game did feature same-sex romances, and then they were removed, and then they were accidentally re-added. And there's this whole interesting backstory. I really do recommend reading about the history of The Sims. It's a wild ride. But at E3, when The Sims was being unveiled, there was a same-sex kiss on screen between two female Sims, and from that point onwards, that was decided that that was going to be kept in the game. That when people were playing The Sims, they had the option of having, either heterosexual pairings or, same-sex pairings of characters, and they could do that to their heart's content. If you wanted to, you could potentially romance lots of Sims at the same time. The game was more than happy for you to do that. However, your Sim may experience consequences for this if they get caught. Later on in The Sims 4, the developers of The Sims have actually been very progressive. They've been very inclusive. They talk a lot with the community. They have now included the option of specifying the sexuality of your Sims. So if you wanted to make sure that a character only ever adhered to a particular sexuality, they could do that. If you wanted your Sim to be bisexual, you could do that too. It gives you a lot more freedom to customize your Sims and play them the way you want to, without romances randomly occurring in the background because you left free will turned on and some strange pairings happened that you wouldn't have considered. But yeah, again, a very interesting one that was a consideration, and it was very, very progressive when it came out too. Like, I will give credit to Maxis for leaving that included in the game. Another one that I remember distinctly from my childhood is Fable, at least the original Fable and its subsequent re-release under the title Fable: The Lost Chapters. So Fable is a strange game. It's an interesting game, sort of devised from the mind of Peter Molyneux. And it concludes the option of getting married. You can buy houses, you can completely destroy the economy, and you can get married to NPCs. The system for this is a bit convoluted, and I'm not going into the mechanics for it. But effectively, if you're attractive and if people like you, they will start to develop more of an attraction to you. And if you want to marry one of them, you can just present them with a wedding ring once their romance meter is high enough, and they'll become betrothed to you. If you then talk to them, you get a little marriage scene, and they'll become your spouse. Now, in Fable, the actual NPCs, they're not really anything special. They're all randomly generated. They don't really have personalities of or any sort. They're kind of a little bit generic. It was more the sort of gimmick that you could get married that drove this rather than the interest of romance. But the game did give you the option of marrying a male character if you wanted to as well, which again, very different from other games of the era that you were being given that choice. And it was a really cool thing to consider that, you could play your hero and you could have them be bi or gay, and the game would just let you do that, which was really cool. But there was a problem with it that not many people seem to be aware of. And this is something that I really want to sort of draw into people's attention, that throughout the game, whenever you get to these major life events, you get these frescoes that appear on the screen, these really nice pieces of artwork that depict parts of your hero's life. And when you go over to this building called the Chamber of Fate, you can see all those frescoes depicted on the wall around you. It's like it's chronicling the life and story of your character. And when you get married, you get one of these as well. It's this pretty bit of artwork of you standing under an altar with your beloved. But you don't get that if you marry a male character. The game cuts to black, and then it fades back in with your spouse now having the spouse icon above their head, but you don't get the cutscene. And there's a lot of reasons for why that could have been, but honestly, it feels like an oversight at best and negligence at worst that people who wanted to play same-sex relationships in Fable 1 was somewhat in some ways punished that they didn't get the cutscene. That, okay, it's a small detail, it's a painting, it's not like a massive deal. It's just it leaves a bit of a bad taste in the mouth that for whatever reason that didn't make it into the final build of the game. But anyway, moving on. Catching up to where we sort of were with Jamie, we're now talking about Baldur's Gate 3. So Baldur's Gate 3 came out, a few months back. It dropped out of early access, and it spawned a lot of conversations online. There has been a lot of discourse regarding the romance options inside Baldur's Gate, specifically for the core tenet that every single character in the game you can romance. I say every character in the game, every companion that is a romance option can be romanced by you regardless of how you build your character. This being a game where you have lots of different species to choose from, where you can choose how you want your character to identify, the pronouns you use. It even gives you the option of choosing your character's genitals if you want to go that far. But none of that makes a difference because you can play any character you want and you can romance any of the romance options you want, and the game is more than happy for you to do that. Which again, it's not new territory, but it's interesting that that's happened, and it's created quite a lot of discussion. The other thing that is really interesting is the way that romance is handled in Baldur's Gate 3. Now, Jamie covered that in his lecture just now, that, you can flirt with the characters, you can do things they like. But the thing that really stood out to me is that unlike other games where you have to proactively flirt with everyone to kind of get things in motion, the characters in Baldur's Gate 3 will actively hit on you. For once, you are the recipient of the affections, and it's up to you if you want to respond to that or not. Now, that's not the same for every character. Some of them will hit on you, others won't. But I found that was a really interesting dynamic that I don't really see discussed enough. That, early into the game, Lae'zel, the character pictured here, she will just actively hit on your character, and she is thirsty for your character. Like, my goodness, there's some of the things she talks about. And again, I've just not really experienced that in a game before, where all of a sudden my character was on the receiving end of the affections. And that's something I would definitely like to see more of. It was quite refreshing to not be the active participant for a change. Now, that thing that I was mentioning before, where characters can be romanced by anyone, the term that's been floating around for that is the concept of characters being player sexual, where the romance options will adhere their interests towards the player and they will always be interested in you. And that term has been floating around a fair bit, and that's kind of the topic of discussion here for me today. Because if the game designs itself to that player sexual idea, that means that the player can ultimately has a very personalized experience. They are playing the game, they are living this fantasy, and they don't have to make considerations for the type of character that they're playing. they can roleplay as anything they physically want to and still have a really good adventure that feels very personal to themselves, which is, from a game design perspective, really, really fascinating. From a character design perspective, and again, forever DM, that's very it's very typical of D&D, because if you're DMing a game and a player wants to romance one of your NPCs, most of the time, unless you've got something very specific planned for that character, you'll just let them do it. And in the context of Baldur's Gate 3, which is, also designed off D&D, it makes perfect sense. But it does change the table a little bit. It alters the rule set for how romance is normally handled. Now, I want to make a very quick interjection here, because the term player sexual isn't the best defined term, and a lot of people have different ideas about what that means. So, I've seen some people reason that the term player sexual, it's just a layman's term, and it's used to describe characters that otherwise would be described as bisexual or pansexual. I've also heard this very strange take that the character sexuality isn't defined at the start of the game. It's defined when the player makes their character, and that the NPCs will just suddenly become whatever sexuality it is to the player character. That reading is unto itself kind of biphobic, because there's biphobic erasure right there. It's claiming that bisexual characters just don't exist. And that's problematic. And the reason I bring that up is because bisexual erasure is a serious problem faced within the LGBT. And whenever that stance is sort of presented, when that bias appears, it does need to be confronted. And ultimately, if a game has a player sexual design ethos, it's ultimately up to the writers to determine what that means for each individual character, but it shouldn't be used as an excuse to try and erase bisexual characters from the setting. Ultimately, it should be used as a celebration to embrace them above all else, which is kind of what happened with Dragon Age 2, which was the game that really did first instigate this discussion when it first kicked off many, many years ago. Because in Dragon Age 2, there were 4 romance options available at the start of the game. Technically, there's 5 with the DLC, but we're not going to talk about Sebastian because the man sucks. He's a really terrible character. I don't like him. Really, really badly written romance. Go away, Sebastian. You're not part of this discussion. But there's 4 characters available in the base game that the player can romance, and all 4 of them were decided well in advance that they were going to all be bisexual, that it didn't make a difference how you were going to build your own personal character, that you would be able to make the choices you wanted to make, you'd be able to experience your own story, and it would be personalized to you every single time you played it. And this was a bit controversial at launch, especially because of some of the comments made by the writer towards the community about how Dragon Age 2 wasn't going to be a game oriented for straight men. And that caused a lot of arguments online, some of which were very satisfying to read the conclusions of. But ultimately, there was this conversation about the actual agency of the NPCs, because if they're all designed to be bisexual, does that have an impact on representation? Because suddenly, by taking this stance, you don't have representation for any gay or lesbian characters at all, which some people really need. It's something that doesn't really get spoken about as much, but when you're watching a film or a TV show, or you're playing a game and there is a character that is very much like you, whatever that means for you as a person, whatever your characteristics are, that gives you that kind of it's one, first of all, it's inspirational to see because you feel represented, at least if it's a good representation, not so much if it's a bad representation, but that's another argument. And it also helps you to feel a bit more normal, especially when you're part of a minority community and the way you are doesn't necessarily fit in with the mainstream culture or the sort of society that you live in. That, actually having representation, it matters. And the conversation that really kicked off was, does having player sexual characters kind of erase that opportunity for positive representation? But ultimately, that's a conversation for later on, because right now, this game had impacts on how other games were implementing romance. So one I'm going to draw attention to is another big game that gets discussed about for the concept of player sexuality is Stardew Valley. Stardew Valley was a farm simulation RPG game. It was inspired by the earlier entries in Harvest Moon, and it gave you the option of romancing one of 8 characters. or multiple if you want to, play it that way. I don't judge. But the really interesting thing with Stardew Valley was that it gave you the option to pursue same-sex romances if you want to, and the older entries in Harvest Moon very much enforced heteronormativity. You had to romance characters of the opposite sex, and to get the best endings in some of the games, you had to get married. That was a hard requirement. If you didn't do that, you wouldn't get the best ending. So going from the older Harvest Moon games where that was enforced to Stardew Valley, that was suddenly a big revival of the farm sim genre, that was giving you the option of playing characters that were more personalized towards you and your experiences. That was massive. For people like me that love this style of game as well, getting the freedom to play characters how you want to play them really did change the way that people were looking at this game. And there's a reason why it's touted as being one of the best of the genre. There's a reason why it's overwhelmingly positive on Steam, because that was such a good representation. And later on, Story of Seasons, long story, rebrand of Harvest Moon, publishers changed. Not going to get into that here. We'll be here all day. When Story of Seasons started remastering some of the old Harvest Moon games, they also made the choice to follow the lead that Stardew Valley had set, and they allowed player sexuality to become a thing. That suddenly you weren't forced to adhere to that same concept of heteronormativity, which was really, really good. Another example I want to talk about was one that released in 2012. And this is one that's lesser known because it's a long game, it's a weird game, and it's full of strange mechanics. But I want to talk about Dragon's Dogma for a second, because Dragon's Dogma had another implementation of the concept of player sexuality, that you could romance, with very few exceptions, almost any single character in the game. And I mean almost any single character in the game. I think there's about 4 or 5 that were off limits. And everyone else, if you liked a character, it didn't make a difference. If the character was established to be in a relationship, it didn't make a difference. Gender identity or how they presented. You could romance any of these characters. But it used this really bizarre and janky mechanic for it called affinity, where over the course of the game, whenever you interacted with an NPC, whenever you completed quests or did things to help them out, you would raise your affinity score with that character. And this was plot crucial, because towards the end of the game, a dragon, this dragon here, this angry chap called Gregory, will effectively pick one of the NPCs in the game. They will be targeted as your beloved. They are your love interest. This is now canon. You are in love with this character. Whichever character you have the highest affinity rating with, they get selected and they get kidnapped. And that's your final moment. That's your call to action, that your love interest has been abducted and you need to go slay the dragon and go save this person. Except there's a bit of an issue with that, because it's an RPG. And if you're playing an RPG, which character, or which characters, like in particular, does the player interact with the most? See, this is where the system fell apart, because it was a nightmare to control. It was very unreliable, and more often than not, you could find out that your character's canonical love interest was someone completely different to who you had in mind. So some players got to that sequence and then, to their horror, discovered that they are now in love with Fornival, a 50. He's old, he's very evil, he gets involved in lots of sketchy business dealings. He's he's bald, he's very, very overweight, and he is not the princess they were expecting. So yeah, I got a few responses here from people who had discovered that Fornival was their love interest. You've got one person here who wanted to argue that Fornival is actually the best love interest, and you have a few people who apparently really liked Fornival. You know what? Fair play to you if that was your thing. But this character is basically his own meme category within the Dragon's Dogma fan base at this point. Other examples are Fester, the very, very annoying who exists entirely to troll you and make a nuisance of himself. And there's one other character that you could end up in a romance with who is problematic for so many reasons. A 14-year-old teenage girl. And yeah, Okay, I need to stop for a second with the jokes and such, because as much as I've been memeing up until this point, this was seriously messed up that the game would let you do this. Because again, this is at the moment that the character becomes your beloved, they become your canonical love interest. They will be with your character and living with you and such in the post-game content. So the fact that this was even an option was very severely messed up, to say the least. But maybe, it was just an accident because, a bunch of characters were made exempt from the beloved system. Maybe someone just forgot to flag this character. Maybe that, was just a mistake someone made, tragic though it is. But, it's okay because this game came out in an era where patching games was available. So clearly Capcom just updated this, right? They did not. They did not bother to patch this in. They did not bother to make this character exempt. They left it in the game. Fast forward a few years, Dragon's Dogma gets re-released as Dragon's Dogma Dark Arisen. It comes out on Xbox, it comes out on PS4, it gets a PC port. They've made a bunch of changes, they've tweaked the affinity system, they've implemented a bunch of new things, and they still did not exempt this character. So to this day, this has never been patched, which honestly, at this point, that kind of implies that this is intended behavior, right? This is something that they wanted you to be able to do, and that's icky to me. That is very, very messed up. So even though all the materials flying around for Dragon's Dogma 2 right now, I can't get excited about that because this is the legacy of that game. This is what Capcom decided was going to be acceptable in the context of the Dragon's Dogma series, which is really sad because I had fond memories of playing this, and I didn't even know this character was a beloved option until I was doing my research for this lecture. I was hoping to drop in a couple of Faunival jokes and then stumbled upon this thing, which is just bad. Seriously, if anyone from Capcom is watching this, feel bad about this. Anyway, moving back onto the player sexual thing. So another game I want to talk about is Skyrim, which Jamie has already discussed, so you already know how the romance from that works. And inside of Skyrim, the way that marriage kind of works is, you complete a small quest, you get an Amulet of Mara, you speak to a character that you want to romance. Typically, you have to do like a small quest or a mission or an objective for them in order to instigate their interest. And once you do that, you get your little marriage ceremony, and boom, you're married. And with that, you didn't really get a whole lot from it. Most of the characters were very simple. They were very sort of two-dimensional. They only have about one or two character traits to them. So even though players did like to discuss which characters were considered the best romances, there weren't really any that you could become overly attached to. Right up until Dawnguard came out a few months later, which added a character called Serana. Serana, a vampire, keeping with today's theme, was a character that you would meet over the course of the Dawnguard storyline, and ultimately would be a companion to you throughout the entire quest chain, regardless of if you picked vampires or vampire hunters. And the thing with Serana is that you meet her, and she's voiced by Laura Bailey. She sounds quite nice to listen to, and she has a backstory. She has interests. She has things she's scared of. She has insecurities. And over the course of the storyline, players started to realize that they were developing chemistry with Serana. They were actually interested in this character, as well as the fact that she would actively inquire about your romantic life. She would be interested in you. And that, ultimately she was the romance option they wanted to pursue. So a bunch of people completed the quest chain, assuming that was a prerequisite, and discovered that Serana isn't a marriage option. You can't romance her, despite her being coded as such. The option just wasn't there, and players were kind of disappointed by that. But this is Skyrim, and one thing that I know very deep down about Skyrim is that players don't care if behavior is intended or not, because mods exist. People very quickly figured out you could run a console command and turn any NPC into a romance option. It did cause some issues because they didn't have voice lines, they didn't have scripts for what to do if they were married, but people made mods for that. People made this mod for Serana that has 380,000 unique downloads. That's 380,000 players that did not care that Serana wasn't intended to be a romance option, because that's what they cared about. From a player experience perspective, what they wanted out of the game took priority over what the creators had intended. So they just did that. They made a mod for it. And to carry on from that, again, the character has no voice lines, so players made their own. They hired a voice actor and put this mod together to replace all of Serana's dialogue and give her those dialogue options. This mod has 812,000 unique downloads. So again, lots of players who wanted more of Serana and were willing to even replace the voice actor in order to get that. And it didn't stop there either, because some players decided, you know what? The new voice actor is good, but I preferred Laura Bailey's, and it sucks that she can't do the voice acting for any more of the character. So let's use AI to do it. Now, this is a big can of worms that I am not willing to crack open in today's content, especially because I'm aware I've got a few minutes left. But ultimately, player experience took priority in this situation. And even though it was a big ethical can of worms about whether you should use someone else's voice or not, players just did it. And so even though that wasn't intended functionality, players proactively made that decision and put their own experiences first. And it wasn't just Serana. They did this for Alistair from Dragon Age Origins, who was, again, designed to be heterosexual, but they decided, hey, if you want to marry him on a male character or romance him, here's the option. You can now do it. What about Judy from Cyberpunk, who players took substantial interest in from her first appearance in Night City Wire, even though she wasn't introduced as a love interest, even though she was shown off just to be a NPC in the game, players very quickly got obsessed with this character and were very interested in her and actively wanted to romance her the day the game came out. Only they discovered that you can't, because she's a lesbian, she's a sapphic character. She's only interested in female Vs. So people made a mod to bypass that system completely. The character's agency, her identity, completely disregarded. The players decided they didn't care. So they just completely steamrolled over that. Same with Dorian, who's, he is very specifically coded to be a gay character. He has some residual trauma from being sort of rejected by his family and subjected to conversion therapy. That's a story that resonates with a lot of audiences. There's sadly too many members of the LGBT who've experienced similar things, who really connected with Dorian, and players just didn't care. They just modded the game and steamrolled over that and said, hey, it doesn't matter to me because I'm interested in the character and it's my game, it's my fantasy, so I'm going to do whatever I want. And this happens so often that these are just a couple of examples of times where players have done this. There's so many more. If you can think of a game where romance options are locked behind some barrier, chances are someone's made a mod to get past that. But just because they did, it doesn't necessarily mean that this is a good thing. And it doesn't necessarily mean that games should just include options regardless, because, hey, players will mod past it anyway. Because ultimately, the thing that we really have to take into consideration is that for marginalized groups in games, seeing representation is an important thing. It really is. Playing games where you see characters that remind you of you, or they're like a version of you that you wish you could be, that is so important. That makes you feel normal. That makes you feel like you're not as alone in the world. And finding out that players are trying to sort of take that away from the characters that you connect with, that can be really uniquely frustrating in so many ways. But it's also inevitable, right? It's going to happen. As long as you can mod games, people will mod games. That's just what people do. So back to the topic of agency versus experience. So when it comes down to it, this whole idea of which thing matters more. Should we have more player sexual design games where players can live their own fantasies and have their own experiences? Or should we err on the side of having less options for the player, but characters that potentially offer more representation? Should we give the NPCs more agency to differ in that regard and potentially not align with what a player might want out of an experience? Or should we conclude that what the player experiences is the most important thing? There are no right or wrong answers to this, and both sides have completely valid reasons for taking the stance that they do. And ultimately, it comes down to each developer. what are you going to design your game around? Which of these two things are you going to prioritize? Because very, very, very rarely can you have both. While Baldur's Gate might be touted as an example of this done right, that is a really rare thing. That's like a Bigfoot sighting. It's like seeing a unicorn. There aren't that many developers who could pull off what Baldur's Gate did and leave both sides pretty happy with both representation and experience. But what I want to know is, people watching this, and thank you for making it through my deranged ramblings this far, what do you think? So I'm going to take questions now for the last 2-3 minutes. But right here, I've got a Woo Clap poll, and I'd like you to tell me, what do you think? When you play a game, what's the most important thing to you? Do you want characters with more agency who might offer better representation, or do you want an experience that's more personal to yourself? Please let me know, and thank you very much. I'm really sorry, Ben. I know you're probably sweating right now because I'm a few minutes away from deadline.
That's perfectly fine. We got some time to get questions, and what I'll do is I will leave Jamie here with you to talk with some questions. Jamie, you have access to the end stream button in the corner, correct?
I do.
Yes. So I'll leave Jamie here with you to answer some questions, and I'll get all set up with our next talk, who is Cameron. Excellent talk, Jennifer, and you can send them over. Okay, thank you very much.
Oh, Jennifer, that was fascinating. It was really awesome to see someone approaching the same kind of thing I do from a totally different angle. We do have a few questions from the chat. Should games allow you to romance any character, or do we as developers have the right to say that some characters are off limits based on our character creation?
So as a DM, my opinion on that is it depends entirely on what the character's purpose is within the context of the storyline. If I make a character that's just a generic quest giver, and the player decides they really click with this character, I'm always inclined to let them do what they want to do. If it's a character that I have a very specific purpose for, like, this character is going to be killed off in Act 3, then maybe at that point I want to put the brakes on it because I don't want to upset the player when I inevitably kill off the character. But again, it comes down to each individual developer and kind of what they want to get out of the experience.
Cool. A less serious question and a more fun note to end us on. What Baldur's Gate character did you romance in your first run, Jennifer?
JB,
I didn't ask the question.
I'm sorry, buddy. I'm looking at you up there. I know you play Two Shoes and you romanced Astarion. I was fully on board Team Minthara. Take that with what you will.
I didn't actually romance Astarion. I went from Will. I broke up with Will, and then I ended up dating the wizard man. And then I left him, and I ended up dating the druid fella. I couldn't settle down with any of them. Anyway, cool. Thank you everyone for coming to Jennifer's talk. I thought it was fascinating. Coming up next, we have the good, the bad, and the ugly of season-based esports with the lovely Cameron Van Blue. That will be starting in just under a minute. Thank you very much. Thank you to Jennifer for doing this lovely talk. The votes have come in.
All right, we are up on time. I'm getting messages from Ben, so we're going to have to terminate here. But thank you very much, everyone, and I hope you enjoyed the chat.
Thank you, everyone. See you in a bit. Bye.